In the golden glow of a Las Vegas stage, under lights so bright they felt like a second sun, Dean Martin stood behind the curtain, holding a glass he barely touched. The crowd outside 370 invited guests was not just any audience. These were producers, club owners, reporters, rising comedians, and old legends who had shaped American entertainment. It was a private industry banquet at the Sands Hotel. Everyone who mattered was there. And so was Sammy Davis Jr. The air felt different that night. Not electric, not warm, heavy. Dean adjusted his tuxedo cufflinks and gave a small half-smile. To the world, he was effortless charm. Smooth voice. Relaxed timing. A man who made everything look easy. But tonight, something felt off. On stage, the host finished a long introduction about the kings of Kula and the men who defined an era. Applause thundered through the ballroom. Sammy stepped up to the microphone first. He looked sharp, confident, energetic the way he always did. The crowd adored him. He could sing, dance, act, joke. He was a storm of talent wrapped in a tailored suit. He began with humor. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sammy said, smiling, "we've shared stages, spotlights, and sometimes even dressing rooms so small you couldn't swing a cat." Laughter. He continued, "But let me tell you something about my dear friend Dean." Dean, still backstage, tilted his head slightly. That word friend should have felt comforting. It didn't. Sammy's tone shifted. "You see, some of us rehearse for hours," he said. "We sweat, we practice, we break our backs to perfect every note." A few people clapped. And then there's Dean. The room quieted, curious. He walks in late, barely glances at the set list, sings like he's half asleep, and somehow gets paid double. Scattered laughter. Dean exhaled slowly. Sammy leaned closer to the mic. "I've always said this, and I'll say it here in front of 370 people. Dean Martin is the only man in show business who made a career out of being a hack." The word hung in the air like smoke. Hack. Not a joke. Not playful teasing. A verdict. The ballroom froze for half a second, just long enough for everyone to realize it wasn't just banter. Then nervous laughter filled the room. Some people clapped uncertainly. Others looked at each other. Backstage, Dean didn't move. His assistant whispered, "He's kidding, right?" Dean didn't answer. Hack. It wasn't just an insult to talent. It was an accusation. Lazy. Fake. Carried by charm, not skill. And it wasn't said privately. It wasn't whispered in a dressing room. It was said publicly, loudly, deliberately. Dean stepped closer to the curtain, watching Sammy continue. "You know I love him," Sammy added quickly. "But sometimes I wonder if he even tries." More laughter. Dean's jaw tightened for a moment, but only for a moment. He had been underestimated his whole life. When he was young, people said he would never make it in music. When he partnered with Jerry Lewis, critics said he was the quieter half. Replaceable. When they split, headlines predicted his career would fade. It didn't. Dean didn't argue with critics. He didn't fight back in interviews. He just showed up. Night after night. Song after song. He knew something most people didn't. Looking effortless takes effort. Making it seem easy is the hardest trick of all. On stage, Sammy finished his speech to applause. "And now," he said with a grin, "let's hear from the man himself, Mr. Relaxed, Mr. No rehearsal, Dean Martin." The crowd clapped louder this time. The curtain opened. Dean walked out slowly. No rush. No anger on his face. Just that familiar, calm expression. The audience watched closely. They expected a joke. A comeback. A playful roast in return. Dean reached the microphone. He looked at Sammy. Then at the crowd. He took a sip from his glass. "Well," he began softly, "I always knew Sammy thought I was talented." The room chuckled nervously. "But I didn't realize he thought I worked that hard." Laughter broke the tension slightly. Dean paused. "You see, He continued, Sammy's right about one thing. I don't rehearse like he does. I don't dance like he does. I don't hit every note like it owes me money. A few smiles appeared. But there's something I do practice every day. He looked directly at Sammy now. I practice making people feel good. Silence. When someone walks into a room after a long day, when they've lost money, lost hope, lost something they can't even name, I don't want them to see effort. He tapped his chest lightly. I want them to feel ease. The room had gone completely quiet. Because life, Dean said gently, is already heavy. If I can make it lighter for 2 hours, then I've done my job. No laughter now. Just listening. He turned back to the audience. You call it being a hack. He shrugged. I call it knowing your audience. A ripple of applause began in the back of the room. Dean wasn't done. And as for trying, he smiled faintly. You don't stay in this business for decades without trying. His voice didn't rise. It didn't sharpen. It stayed calm, controlled. But I've learned something, he added. When you know who you are, you don't have to shout about it. The applause grew louder. Sammy stood still, hands folded, his confident grin fading slightly. Dean stepped closer to him, not aggressively, not dramatically, just enough to be heard clearly without the microphone. You're one of the hardest working men I know, Dean said quietly, but the mic caught it. And I respect that. He paused. But don't confuse noise with depth. The room erupted. Applause. Whistles. A few people even stood up. Not because Dean insulted Sammy, but because he didn't. He responded with control, with dignity, with truth. Sammy forced a smile, but something in his eyes shifted. For the first time that night, he looked uncertain. Dean placed a gentle hand on Sammy's shoulder. We're different, he said. And that's okay. Then he turned to the band. Let's give them something real. The orchestra began to play softly. Dean started singing, not loudly, not theatrically, smooth, steady, warm. The kind of voice that didn't demand attention. It invited it. The room that had been buzzing with tension just minutes ago now felt wrapped in velvet. People leaned back in their chairs. Some closed their eyes. A woman near the front wiped away a tear. And Sammy. He stood there, listening. Not to a hack, but to a man who understood something deeper than applause. When the song ended, the entire ballroom stood. A full standing ovation. 370 people. Dean nodded slightly, almost shyly. He didn't look triumphant. He looked peaceful. As he walked off stage, he passed Sammy again. For a second, their eyes met. No anger. No revenge. Just understanding. Because sometimes, the most powerful response isn't louder. It's steadier. And that night, in front of 370 witnesses, Dean Martin didn't just defend his talent. He showed what quiet confidence looks like. And somewhere inside that crowded ballroom, one man realized something uncomfortable. Hard work is powerful. But grace under fire, that's unforgettable. The applause that followed Dean's performance echoed long after the final note faded. But when the curtains closed, and the orchestra packed their instruments, the real story began in the quiet. Backstage at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas, the air felt different. No cameras. No microphones. Just people pretending not to stare. Dean Martin walked calmly toward his dressing room. He did not rush. He did not celebrate. He simply nodded at crew members and thanked the band, as if nothing unusual had happened. Inside, he placed his glass on the table and loosened his tie. His reflection in the mirror looked the same as always, relaxed, almost distant. But his eyes carried weight. A knock came at the door. It opened before he answered. Sammy Davis Jr. stepped inside. For a moment, neither man spoke. Sammy closed the door behind him. The hallway noise disappeared. Now it was just two legends and the truth hanging between them. You handled that well, Sammy said, trying to sound casual. Dean gave a small smile. Handled what? Sammy exhaled slowly. You know what? Dean sat down and began removing his cufflinks. It was a show. We gave them one. Sammy studied him. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. Dean looked up, finally meeting his eyes. Then why say it that way? The question was calm. Not sharp. Not angry. Just honest. Sammy paced once across the room. You ever get tired of people saying everything comes easy to you? He asked. Like you don't fight for it. Dean leaned back. People have been saying that since the beginning. With Jerry, Sammy added carefully, referring to Jerry Lewis. They said he was the engine, and you were the passenger. Dean's expression didn't change. And what do you think? Sammy stopped pacing. I think you made it look easy. Too easy. And sometimes that bothers people. Dean nodded slightly. Including you. Silence filled the room again. Sammy's voice dropped. I work hard, Dean. I have to. Every show feels like a test. Every stage feels like I have something to prove. Dean listened without interrupting. You walk out there, Sammy continued, barely move, barely try, and they love you. Do you know what that feels like to someone who rehearses until their feet bleed? Dean stood slowly. I do try, he said quietly. You just don't see it. Sammy looked up. You think I don't rehearse? Dean asked. You think I don't study timing, tone, when to pause, when to breathe? You think I don't carry the weight of expectations? His voice never rose. I just don't show the struggle on stage. Sammy swallowed. Dean stepped closer. You give them power. Fire. Movement. It's incredible. He paused. I give them calm. The words settled heavily. There's more than one way to move a crowd, Dean continued. Some nights they need electricity. Some nights they need peace. Sammy looked down at the floor. Calling you a hack, that was wrong. Dean did not respond immediately. I let my frustration talk, Sammy admitted. Not my respect. Dean walked past him and opened the dressing room door slightly, letting in the distant hum of the casino. You know what hurt? Dean asked softly. Sammy looked up again. Not the word. I've heard worse. Dean met his eyes once more. It was that you believed it, even for a second. The honesty struck deeper than any insult. Sammy's shoulders lowered. I didn't believe it. I just wanted to feel bigger. The confession lingered in the air. Dean nodded slowly. You are big, Sam. You don't need to shrink someone else to prove it. For the first time that night, Sammy's confidence cracked. Do you ever get tired of being calm? He asked. Dean gave a faint smile. Every day. A small, genuine laugh escaped Sammy. Then why do you stay that way? He asked. Dean looked toward the stage entrance at the end of the hallway. Because someone in that audience needed steady tonight. And if I lose control, they lose their escape. Sammy absorbed that quietly. After a long pause, he extended his hand. I'm sorry. Dean looked at it, then shook it firmly. No hard feelings, Dean said. But before Sammy turned to leave, Dean added one more sentence. Next time, if you have something to say about me, say it to me first. Sammy nodded. That's fair. He opened the door and stepped into the hallway, where whispers immediately followed him. Dean remained alone in the dressing room. He sat back down, staring at the mirror again. He had won the room. But that was never the goal. The real victory was keeping his character when it was tested. Outside, the 370 guests continued discussing what they had witnessed. Some admired Sammy's honesty. Others praised Dean's composure. But everyone agreed on one thing: they had just seen the difference between reacting and responding. Later that night, as the lights of Las Vegas flickered against the desert sky, two performers left the building separately. One was thinking about pride. The other was thinking about peace. And somewhere between those two thoughts, a deeper understanding had begun. The story did not end in that dressing room. In the days that followed, word of what happened at the Sands spread quietly through Las Vegas and beyond. Industry magazines hinted at tension between legends. Radio hosts replayed fragments of the banquet speech. Reporters tried to turn a private moment into public drama. But neither Dean Martin nor Sammy Davis Jr. gave them what they wanted. No interviews. No accusations. No headlines. Still, the weight of that night followed them. A week later, both men were scheduled to appear again at the Sands Hotel. Different event. Different audience. But the same stage. Backstage, crew members moved carefully, as if loud footsteps might reopen old tension. Sammy arrived early. That was his habit. He walked the stage alone before rehearsal, measuring distance with his steps. He clapped once to test the acoustics. He hummed scales under his breath. But this time, something distracted him. Dean's words echoed in his mind. "You don't need to shrink someone else to prove it." Sammy sat down at the edge of the stage and stared at the empty seats. He had spent his entire life fighting for respect. Fighting stereotypes. Fighting rejection. Every show felt like proof that he belonged. But had that fight quietly turned into comparison? Had competition blurred into insecurity? The stage manager interrupted his thoughts. "Dean just arrived." Sammy nodded. He stood up and walked toward the backstage hallway. Dean was speaking calmly with a band member, discussing tempo for the evening set. His posture was relaxed, his voice steady. No sign of lingering tension. Sammy waited until the conversation ended. "Morning," he said. Dean turned and gave a simple nod. "Morning, Sam." There was no awkwardness. Just two professionals acknowledging each other. Sammy hesitated, then spoke clearly. "I've been thinking, that can be dangerous," Dean replied lightly. Sammy allowed a small smile. "About what you said?" Dean folded his hands. "Which part?" "The part about calm." Dean didn't answer immediately. Sammy continued. "I always thought energy wins the room. Movement. Volume. Force. But that night, you barely raised your voice, and the entire place stood up." Dean looked at him closely. "You think they stood because I was louder?" "No," Sammy admitted. "They stood because you were steady." The word hung between them. Steady. Sammy took a breath. "I've been chasing applause so long, I forgot what it feels like to just hold the room." Dean leaned against a table. "You don't chase applause, Sam. You earn it." "But maybe I've been chasing something else," Sammy said quietly. Validation. The honesty surprised even him. Dean studied him carefully. "Everyone wants validation. The mistake is thinking it only comes from comparison." Sammy nodded slowly. "You and I," Dean continued, "we're not in the same lane. We're not supposed to be." A crew member passed by, pretending not to listen. "You bring fire," Dean said. "I bring ease. Both matter." Sammy exhaled deeply. "That word I used, hack. It came from a place I didn't understand." Dean's expression softened. "Sometimes we criticize what we secretly wish we could master." Sammy looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "You work harder than anyone I know," Dean said. "But maybe part of you wishes it felt lighter." The truth of that statement hit hard. Sammy had never admitted it out loud. The rehearsals. The pressure. The constant proving. What would it feel like to step on stage without carrying all of it? Later that evening, the ballroom filled again. Not 370 industry insiders this time, but regular guests. Couples on vacation. Businessmen. Tourists looking for a night of music and laughter. Dean performed first. He sang with the same relaxed timing, the same effortless tone. The crowd swayed gently, comfortable in his presence. Then it was Sammy's turn. The band struck a fast rhythm. Normally, Sammy would burst onto the stage with explosive energy. Tonight, he walked out slower. He stood at the microphone for a moment before singing. He let the silence settle. Then he began. Not with fire. With control. The audience leaned in. There was still power in his voice, still skill in his movement. But there was also something new: restraint. He wasn't fighting the room. He was guiding it. Backstage, Dean listened carefully. A small, knowing smile appeared on his face. When Sammy finished, the applause was strong and sincere. But more importantly, it felt different. Grounded. After the show, Sammy found Dean near the exit. "Well?" Sammy asked. Dean nodded once. "You didn't rush," Sammy smiled. "Felt strange. Get used to it," Dean replied. They stood side by side as guests passed, shaking hands and offering compliments. No rivalry. No tension. Just mutual respect. That night, Sammy understood something deeper than applause. Talent shines. Hard work builds. But character sustains. And sometimes, the loudest growth happens in quiet reflection. Time has a way of softening sharp moments. Weeks passed after that second performance at the Sands. The whispers faded. The reporters moved on. Las Vegas found a new rumor to chase. But something lasting had changed between Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. One evening, both men were invited to a private charity event in Los Angeles. It was smaller than the Las Vegas banquet. No major press. No dramatic introductions. Just musicians, actors, and a quiet cause that needed support. Backstage, there was no tension this time. Dean sat in a chair, reading a folded program. Sammy adjusted his cufflinks in the mirror. "You nervous?" Sammy asked casually. Dean glanced up. "About what?" "About being called a hack again," Sammy replied with a faint smile. Dean chuckled softly. "Only if you write it into the script." They both laughed. And the laughter was real. A young performer stood nearby, watching them with admiration. He had overheard the old story. The insult, the response, the standing ovation. To him, they were giants. He finally gathered the courage to speak. "Mr. Martin, Mr. Davis, how do you handle criticism like that?" Publicly, the question hung in the air. Dean looked at Sammy, as if offering him the first answer. Sammy thought for a moment. "You learn that the stage magnifies everything," he said. Double quotes, talent. Ego. Fear. "If you're not careful, it magnifies insecurity too." The young performer nodded slowly. Dean folded the program and added quietly, "And you learn that not every word deserves a reaction." The room grew still. The young man asked, "But doesn't it hurt?" Dean did not pretend otherwise. "Of course it hurts. We're human," Sammy continued. "The difference is what you do next." Dean stood and adjusted his jacket. "You can protect your pride, or you can protect your character. You don't always get to do both." The young performer absorbed every word. Moments later, they were called to the stage together. No rivalry, no tension, just two seasoned performers, standing under soft lights. Dean spoke first, thanking the guests for supporting the cause. His voice was steady and forced. Then he introduced Sammy with genuine respect. "And now," Dean said, "a man who reminds me that passion still matters." Sammy stepped forward. He looked at Dean before addressing the audience. "And a man who reminds me that calm is strength." The audience applauded warmly. They performed together that night, not as competitors, not as men trying to outshine one another, but as artists who understood their differences. One brought rhythm and spark. The other brought smoothness and ease. The harmony was not just in the music. It was in the understanding. After the show, as they exited through a quiet hallway, Sammy slowed his pace. "You know," he said, "that night in Vegas, when I said what I said, I thought I was exposing you." Dean raised an eyebrow slightly. "But really," Sammy continued, "I was exposing myself." Dean did not rush to fill the silence. "I realized something," Sammy said. "Confidence doesn't need comparison. It stands on its own." Dean nodded once. "And respect isn't automatic. It's chosen." They reached the exit doors. Outside, the city lights shimmered, cars passed. Conversations drifted into the night air. Sammy extended his hand again, not out of apology this time, but out of recognition. Dean shook it firmly. No crowd, no applause, just mutual respect earned. Quietly, as they parted ways, the lesson of that banquet night remained clear. It was never about a single word spoken in front of 370 people. It was about the response, about restraint over reaction, about dignity under pressure. In a world where noise often wins attention, Dean proved that steadiness wins respect, and Sammy proved that growth begins when pride steps aside. Years later, people would remember the performances, the laughter, the music. But those who were in that ballroom would remember something else. They would remember the night when an insult met grace, and grace stood taller. That is the measure of a man.